proactive people in Kona in Hawaii succeeded in getting the teenage pregnancy rate down from, oh, I don't know, it was humongous. Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of teenage pregnancies, highest in the United States, but I can't remember the number. Well, they got it down by 80%. But child abuse went up by 300% the next year. See, because the issue is not just saving the baby. The baby may be dead from child abuse. If you don't somehow help change the cultural violence, culture of incest, which is rampant in Hawaii, culture of absent husbands, powerless women. So it is fine to have a flag you carry and are working on, but you have to realize all the other flags are really important too. We're not competing to see who's more important, people that work to change the law or people that work to change businesses. We're complementing each other, and the society needs all of it. And it needs evangelists too, so we're not competing with them. Okay, now we're going to try to focus just basically on business in the scriptures. So I can be a strategist, but I refuse to be a strategist at this stage in my life. Because strategy has to be applied in time and space in a particular place. And you have to know, where are they? And why are they there? So a strategy can't be conceived in a vacuum. It can only be conceived on the ground with the people that the strategy is for. Values can be conceived in a vacuum, and you say, okay, I'm going to take these values with me, and wherever I go, this will be part of my thinking and my strategy. But literally, there is no one way to help build the world's economy and eliminate poverty. There are a gazillion ways. But there are some basic principles that have to be in place or it won't happen. Basic values. Okay, so I had a guy say to me a few weeks ago in West Africa, Southern Africa leadership group. He said to me, I find you so philosophical. And I said, what about theft is philosophical? I couldn't believe it, because I don't find a value set. Do not murder me because my life is sacred to God. I don't find that philosophical. Do you? I find that very pragmatic. But God gives us the reason as well. And then I showed him all the economic scriptures in the prophets. So the prophets tell us what will destroy a nation. Okay, and there are 5 things that will destroy a nation. And this is in the order of their emphasis in the prophets. Political injustice, economic injustice, adultery and the destruction of the family, false witness and the destruction of the value of our words, and idolatry. Idolatry of believers. So lost people are idolatrous by necessity. They have no choice. They're just lost. Believers who have idolatrous thinking in their Christian faith have no flavor. Therefore, there's no hope of healing and reformation. So when you see Southern Africa evangelized, probably 70% of Southern Africa, probably the most saturated part of the world, continent-wise, with Christians. South America is probably second. China will soon make us all look like, if you just take Christians, China's probably number 1, but not proportion. and nothing changes on the ground. Well, how can that be? How can you have 50 years of 40, 50, 60% of the people converted and going to church and nothing changed? Well, because nothing changed in their thinking about the rest of life. They still think like Brazilians. They still think like South Americans. They still think like Americans. You don't have to go to Africa or South America. You can go to California and say, oh, there are whole counties that the vast majority of people are Spirit-filled Christians going to some of the greatest churches that sprang up in the 60s and the 70s. But nothing's changed in California. Why? Because Jesus and a relationship with Him is placed over the way they already think. And you know this is true when it comes to Americans. You know we think if we think it, it must be God. Okay, I'm going to give you that. As an American, I'm going to say you're right. We have a tendency to think the American way is God's way. And believe it or not, some of it actually is. But some of it actually isn't. But here's what you don't know. You think the same way. You have laid the Jesus relationship over the top of a culturally discipled mind. And you have a tendency to read Scripture, picking and choosing the Scriptures that fit what you already believe. So, some point in the next 2 days, you will say to me, but there's a Scripture that says, and I'm going to let you do that, and then I'm going to tell you that I don't care. Because there's a Scripture that says everything. But what does that Scripture mean in the context of all of Scripture is what's important. And so I've told you ahead of time, I will point it out. I've told you ahead of time, I don't care. Because if you read the whole Bible with that one Scripture in mind, I guarantee you, you will walk away believing that the meaning of that Scripture is not what you thought it was. So women are saved by childbirth. Personal favorite, except I didn't marry, and oh man, I'm way too old to have a baby now. See, clearly that Scripture doesn't mean the obvious. Okay? But I could take it out all by itself and make a doctrine out of it and welcome all the pregnant women into the kingdom. But it doesn't mean that. Well, then what does it mean? And the rest of Scripture judges the meaning of that. Okay, so I have been going through the whole of the Bible now. I don't know, I've got 7 or 8 colored Bibles. And for me, there's no magic to the coloring, but I'm dyslexic and I'm an artist, and I have to do something with my hands and connect kinetically with the page. I will never be able to study from a computer screen. And I have to color. So if that works for you, do it. If it doesn't work for you, forget it. Because the only point is, let's give God a chance to speak for Himself from Genesis to Revelation on the subject we think we're trying to serve Him in. Okay? Because you can't build the kingdom on earth your cultural way. Because the kingdom is a different culture. Agreeing often with your cultural way, but often in very fundamental ways disagreeing. So we have poverty in countries for cultural reasons. We have greed and self-centeredness in other countries for cultural reasons. And before we can help someone break their culture, we have to have broken ours. So Americans don't like my teaching very much, which is okay because I'm not called to America. My friends in Omaha, one time I went to speak, and it was right in the middle of it was right in the beginning of the Gulf War, and they said, "Boy, you talk like the enemy." Well, I suppose God often does speak to our culture as though He were its enemy, because He does judge the cultures. And of course, that's what he's coming in Revelation 10 to do. I think it's 10. Okay, so if you take the whole, there are some things we can say God overwhelmingly emphasizes and Jesus supports. One thing you can say is that God is poor-centric. When it comes to political and economic justice, the thing God focuses our attention on, the thing God measures our economy or justice system by, is not the GNP, but how the guy at the bottom's doing. Okay, now for decades, the world has used the Western GNP evaluation. Well, that's so Western, isn't it? We love abstractions. So the GNP says we're making a lot of money. We're making more money than we did last year. But see, that doesn't make us, in God's eyes, a wealthy nation. Because God is looking at what did that development do for the outcasts, the bottom of the economic rung. So I lived 11 years in Hawaii, on the island of Hawaii. Very beautiful place. When I moved there, there was only one stoplight. When we built the second grocery store, everybody in town showed up because it was a party. It was the biggest thing that had happened in quite a while. Well, now it's booming. And they've got Kmart, they've got Walmart, they got Sam's, they got Target, they got every fast food place Americans can't live without. Now, what I found myself, I was there in November, what I found myself doing is looking, okay, all this development, multi-million-dollar houses, booming construction everywhere. I kept looking at the Hawaiians, the indigenous Hawaiians, looking for them and looking, what are they driving? What are they wearing? Where are they working? Because my only interest was to know, in all of this booming economy, how are the locals doing? Because it's not development if they're living the same way they were 10 years ago. Do you see that? Not in God's eyes. Now, I lived there for 11 years and never asked that question. But that's because I'd never studied God and economics. It just never occurred to me to even, well, they got their little thing, and this is the way they live, and we got our little thing. And okay, so God is looking to fundamentally rewire the way we analyze the situations we go into. And God is the only God that is poor-centric. All other gods created by man are egocentric. Well, of course they are. Because we invented them. And why did we invent them? Because we're egocentric. So you have to know the way this is expressed is the widow, the orphan, and the alien. Now, to bring that forward to the 21st century, you'd have to say the disenfranchised. So this will be different. In Europe, definitely it's the aliens that are disenfranchised. It's the foreign workers that after 3 generations, they still won't give them citizenship status. Okay, but the widow and the orphan does really well in Western Europe. It's not an issue. In South Africa, the bottom of the rung would be the blacks, and the bottom of the bottom would be the foreign blacks, the ones that come in from Zimbabwe and Malawi and places like that. The bottom of the bottom of the bottom would be black women and orphans. Okay, but you wouldn't find many white people on the bottom. It exists, but it's marginal. Okay, in America, it might be single mothers. babies are too little for them to go to work. They were too young when they had the babies to have any work skill. Fathers are long gone. And of course, the bottom of that bottom would be single mothers of color. So Hispanic or black, probably not Asian, because the Asian community pretty much circles the wagons and takes care of their own, which is not to mean that the others have no concern for the community, but it's just a fact. Okay, so when we are looking at development, we are asking the question, how is it eliminating poverty? So God says, and it was chapter 15 of Deuteronomy that should have been on that slide. That was the one I intended to have on it, not chapter 23, although there's something on economics in there too. So in chapter 15, he says, in the land I am giving you, you will have no poverty. That's kingdom economic objective. No poverty. If your mission statement doesn't have the elimination of poverty in it, it's not a kingdom mission statement. Now, that doesn't mean you're going to single-handedly do it. It means it's part of your agenda. You're going to be looking for ways to do it. God gives to business responsibility for development. God gives to the church responsibility for aid, and that means you are schizophrenic because you don't know which one you are. Okay, don't feel bad. I've been teaching business people all over the world for 20 years, and we're only beginning to wake up to the fact that we don't have a clue what we're doing. But we're doing it at all speed with all passion and gusto. Well, that's human nature. We learn by making mistakes. I've been watching South Africa for 20 years. They got this message that I gave you yesterday 20 years ago, and they ran with it. They started a Christian political party, and they started active groups transforming to Swanee and groups that were taking on cities. And 15 years in, they went, help! Because all they had were God's headlines. They didn't have God's thinking. So it takes 10 to 15 years to fail enough on the first round of revelation that you're ready for the second round of revelation. I say, man. Yeah, well, there you go. So you better not be working for this life, huh? See, I'm already studying stuff I'm never going to teach on this planet. Isn't that exciting? Yes. I'm studying stuff that's not for this planet. But I'm going to use it, see, because we're going to judge the angels. What does that look like? I don't know, but it's going to be a blast. See, we're going to judge by the same standards we judge ourselves. I'm preparing. See, we're going to establish new nations. Whoa. That's just, I get goosebumps. See, because if you're working for this life, you of all people by my age and your age are most miserable. Because you're not going to get that much more done. Although every minute of my life at this stage is more valuable in what I can give than every hour of my earlier life was. So there is compensation. Okay, aid is only for those who will die if they won't get it. Okay, so Haiti has to have tons of aid right now because if we don't jump in there as an international community with all of our resources, they're just going to be dying like flies because the next thing is infection, which has already started, and the next thing is communicable diseases. because there's no pure water, no sanitation, no sewers. And it may be too late to save Haiti, but we are never to give up on a nation. We are to try. God never gives up on a nation and says, well, let them go. So we must jump in there and try to give the Haitian people a chance to get a hold of the God that so many of them believe in. And part of the disaster of Haiti is the building codes. You see, if you love life, you won't build buildings that fall down when the earth shakes. All of the countries surrounding Haiti have the same earthquakes, but people don't die like this. Why? Because they put rebar in their concrete. You can't love life and have no building codes. You can't love life. Remember, just before the Olympics, China had that earthquake in the north and schools fell down? That was God, not the earthquake. The earthquake's just going to happen. But the timing of that was to show the world and China, you can't say you are a just people and put children in schools that have no rebar. I love God's timing. And then they had another little quake on Nepal, the Nepal border. Remember that? Right at the same time. So here's China in its highlight of saying we are just an economically developed nation. We want to enter the nation of the world. And China goes, God goes, little earthquake here. How about Nepal? No justice at all. No voice, no representation. Okay, so aid beyond disaster relief will destroy the economy. Aid beyond disaster relief, short-term relief to save lives, will destroy an economy. Everyone in the world who works with aid knows this, and every country in the world that receives aid knows this. Giveaway programs do not develop economies. They diminish initiative. They diminish forward planning, and they create a comfort zone of subsistence living. Well, I'm not dying today. Okay, so God gives Israel aid in the wilderness. He gives them aid for 40 years because they don't have any food. Of course, they weren't supposed to be out there for 40 years, but now they will be. So God even gives aid to the stubborn. But the day they step into the promised land, the aid stops. Now, they didn't have anything more materially the day they step into the promised land than they did the day before. But the day before, there was nothing to buy and sell. The day after, there are communities around them they can trade with. Now, they can either trade until they have nothing left, or they can begin to trade and to begin to produce. So they are forced into becoming more productive. But now they will starve to death, not because there is no chance of doing anything. In Canaan, they will starve to death because they refuse to do anything. And of course, they've been slaves for 400 years. They don't connect work with income. And that is a truly undeveloped nation where they've worked for centuries, but it's not tied to income. So work in their cultural mindset doesn't change anything. So you look at the Indians, they're like little worker bees. You know, but it doesn't go anywhere. It's subsistence level. work harder would not produce more. You just die quicker. Okay, so we have to deal with that mindset, but it's not new. It was there in the Jews when they left Egypt. Motivation was God's issue. They said, let's go back and be slaves. It was better. We can eat leeks and onions. That's not too bad. At least we ate. And so don't think, oh gosh, but it's so hard to motivate these people in this country. Yes, it always has been, and it always will be. Okay, so to business then, God says to the church, or this would be where I would put nonprofits or NGOs. Help with disaster. But if you're looking at development, you're looking at change in the government that creates a playing field that's free and open, and you're working for change in the mindset of the people. And that's going to happen, if it's going to happen at all, through the government and through the businesses. So when God says, you shall have no poor among you, he's speaking to the business community. He's not speaking to Moses. Okay, now, so God's strategy for economic development is enablement. Meaning the solution to any community's poverty is in the community. Now, if I could get this in your head and your heart and your spirit, you would be transformed in your strategy thinking. Let me repeat that, because it was so simple you don't think I said anything. The solution for any community's problems are in the community. Otherwise, the poor are the solution for the poor. And if you don't believe that, you don't believe God is the creator of all human beings, and all human beings are created in the image of God. Now we've got to go back to number one. You say, no, surely the poor need an educated first economy me. No. In fact, you may be the problem. Why? Because you think you're the solution. You think their problem is something outside. No, their problem is not anything outside. Their problem is in their minds and in their community and in how they think and work. So here's a strategy that ignores this. And this is a global strategy amongst Christians. Well, I'll go over here and do this business and make a lot of money, and then I'll give this money to groups that are helping poor people. It's not God's strategy. Okay, so God's strategy would be, I go into that community and I work with them to find out what is it they could do. Because the future of the economy of a country or the economy of the world is in the poor. It's not in the rich. So South Africa, this is very delineated. Got 20% of white and some colored and some blacks now that live in a first world economy. We have first world grocery stores, we have first world transportation, we have first world health care. The first heart transplant was in Cape Town. You know, we're first world. Sorry people don't like first, second, and third world, but what else are we going to use? So excuse me, I find it convenient. I hope it won't offend you terribly. I'm talking about money, not the value of the people. Okay? Okay. So the Christians who want to do something about the 40 or 50% unemployment we have in South Africa conceive, well, they could go over here and they could buy a Mercedes dealership and sell Mercedes to Constancia and downtown Cape Tonians. And then they could go out to the township and help the black people. But how many Mercedes are you going to sell to 20% of the population? You know, you can make money selling Mercedes, but there are more and more people in the world who don't need one. Okay? Now, so your market for Mercedes is getting smaller and smaller in proportion to the human race. Not smaller and smaller in proportion to the Mercedes you sold last year, but more and more of the human race cannot afford and never will be buying a Mercedes. And the issue for any economy ultimately is, where are the people? Where's the market? So, of course, the economy has shifted to Asia. They have 2/3 of the world's population. Who on earth can afford to buy a European product? About 20% of the world. An increasingly small percentage. 80 to 90% of the world will not even think about it. They won't even dream of it. Okay, so you can sell 1,000 Mercedes and you can make $20,000 on each of them. Okay, so your niche of the Mercedes pie, your lifetime income is going to be, what is that, 2 million? 20 million? Yeah, 20 million. Okay, so not bad. But you didn't do anything to change the economy. You made a very good lifestyle. I'm sure your pastor was grateful for your tithe. But you could have made a lot more money. If you just turned around and looked at the 80% of the people in South Africa and asked the question, what do they need they can't get? Okay, now instead of looking at 20% of the population, you're looking at 80% of the population. I was working with a group of businessmen in what used to be called Joburg, in Pretoria. It's now called Tshwane, our new megacity. And they said, here's our 5-year plan for the area. We're going to start 300 businesses. Elaborated a little bit, and I stopped them. I said, can you tell me how many jobs you think these 300 businesses are going to create? 300 businesses, very ambitious in 5 years. I applaud their visionary passion. Guy said, 2,000, maybe 3. And I said, how many unemployed are there in Tshwane? He said, 3 million. I said, okay. At best, 3,000 in 5 years, 3,000 in 5 more years, and 3,000 in 5 more years. I said, whoa. The birth rate's going to outstretch our employment strategy. So I said, what if you, instead of thinking the business of business is businesses, what if you think in terms of the business of businesses is jobs and services? So you're not thinking about how do I start a business, you're thinking about what do people need that they don't have, and who's unemployed. Now you would have to do this if you were pioneering a nation. So I tell the South Africans, nobody landed in Cape Town from Holland and England and said, well, I want to make the Mercedes of all ox carts. So I will become a Mercedes ox cart dealer. Because Nobody needs a Mercedes ox cart. They're all trying to survive. So you look at the 200, 300 people that have landed with you and you ask, what do we as a community need to survive and how can I make it? There aren't any designer businesses in your mind. Well, I would like to be a hairdresser. You know, you go, well, there's no money there. But today we have this airy-fairy idea that somehow, you know, our job should fulfill our fantasy of the real I don't know what. But the business of business is jobs and services. We don't need another ketchup in America. It's not immoral to make 60 different kinds of ketchup, but it is such a waste of time. It could be immoral if you knew better. You know, you drive out in Cape Town and the sign across the street says liposuction. And it just, I just am so offended. Who needs it? I mean, is liposuction immoral? But no, but you know, they're doing it for money. They could do something that would actually help the poor and make money. But liposuction in South Africa? Sorry, I'm on a tirade. Okay, so I said to these guys, so let's suppose you're looking the wrong direction. You're looking, what businesses can we start, and then how can we help the poor? Suppose you turn around and say, okay, millions of poor people right here. What do they need? They have a hard time getting. The guy that chaired the group went, oh my gosh. I said, what? He said, I got a call from the bread company a few weeks ago, and the bread company, the guy at the bread company said, we make plenty of bread to service our community. You know, there's not a loss of the product, but we have no distribution in the townships. I said, how many distributors does he need? He said, 10,000. I said, you're going to start 300 businesses to employ, you're going to create a product, create a market, create employment, that 3,000 people, and this guy just said, the market's there, the product's here, I can have 10,000 jobs tomorrow, and you didn't think that was a good idea? But see, we don't look at the poor as the future. We look at them as the problem. So I said, okay, we got bread distribution. We got a bread distribution company that's 10,000 jobs, except people in the township come and go at all sorts of times of day, so I think we need to run at least two, what's the word I want, shifts. So that's 20,000 jobs. Now we have to have some place to distribute the bread from. We need 10,000 locations. That's a real estate company. That's how McDonald's International makes their money. And then we need 10,000 Golden Arch bread shacks. Now we have a construction company. We can hire 20,000 people in the next 12 months. Now, if you're thinking kingdom, you're looking that direction. Enablement. Enable them to take care of themselves by providing what they need. A movie in India never loses money, ever. They made, a few years ago, they were making 700 and some films. America was making 800 and some films. India may have surpassed the numbers now that we actually make in America. But America and India are the two most prolific movie producers in the world. Most American films lose money. No Indian film ever loses money. What's the secret? Well, if you make a film that taps into 20% of the population of your country, then 80% of the people are uninterested in your film. And if you charge $10 a film, anyone with children cannot be interested in your film. So the fewer people that go, the more your film costs, which means the fewer people go. In India, how many people live in India now? Just over a billion. You make a film that Indian people love and you charge 1 rupee. And 1 billion people go. Get it? You can't lose money. Why? Because your market is absolutely huge. On that bread, I figured we could mark it up 25, half a rand, I'll say it that way, and they would have been making about 100,000 rand a week. So not only would everyone have been paid a good salary, but there was profit in the distribution business. Okay, so you turn that over, you get a good manager from the community, and you turn that over to him, and you go, okay, what's the next thing they need in the township? And I said, you guys, I already know what it is. Actually, if you'd visit the township, you would know that too. They need primary health care. So they need a little drugstore that gives out alcohol and bandages where somebody can stitch up cuts so they don't have to go to emergency to get an aspirin. That could be right next to the Golden Arches of bread distribution. Come get your bread. Come find out if you should go to the hospital or if this is something that a primary health care giver can give you along with the basic medicines. We work with the government to issue a primary health care certificate, so this is a definable job with a certificate, and it's official. But it's a fast track to being helping people at the lowest end. They're not thinking about that yet. Okay, now is it wrong to do other kinds of businesses? No, but you asked me, what is a kingdom business? Well, a kingdom business is a good business. What is a kingdom pilot? What is a kingdom airplane? One that stays in the air until you intend to land. What is a kingdom pilot? A guy that knows how to fly the plane. See, because this is already kingdom. And so you don't have to make business kingdom. Business is kingdom. And if you do it well, as Fortune 500 companies do, you are probably using 70 to 80% of the biblical principles of business. You just don't know it. But if you want to be strategically a business change agent, which you don't have to be. You either are or you aren't. Then you're going to focus on the poor. Okay, because what happens when a poor man or woman is employed? They become a consumer. What happens when they can consume? The businesses that provide what they need begin to do better. What happens when they do better? They hire more people. What happens when they hire more people? They create more consumers. And what do? They go out and buy things. They buy things that they need. What happens then? The guy that makes what they need has to create a larger distribution network because more and more people can buy bread. Number one problem in all developing nations, clean water. Number one killer of life on planet Earth is dirty water. Number one cause of disease. Okay? So 4 billion people or more need clean water. Now, if you could make a reusable water filter that's small enough to put in your pocket, and has a ceramic filter or something that can be cleaned with a little metal brush, and you can produce that for $1, I guarantee you, if it works, you'll sell 2 billion of them or more. When you go to the poorest part of the world, everybody's got batteries. Why? Because they got a little radio. They got something. They got a cell phone. Poor people are not in the place that they have no money. Poor people don't have enough money. And in the townships, they get these huge speaker systems in their shacks. Really distorted sense of what gives you value, but I have a sneaking suspicion my culture sold them on it. You know, but they're walking to work. They could buy a car for what they've spent on the sound system, but that's not in their value system. Well, it's okay. It's better for the environment if they walk anyway, if they don't care. But what do they need? Now, Koreans and Chinese all over the world, and before them, Jews and Lebanese, always go into the poorest of the poor communities. That's true in America. You go to the inner city in America, the poorest area, who owns the little local grocery store? A Korean. Who owns the liquor store? Korean or a Chinese guy. Or it might be an Arab. Invariably, the people in the poorest areas of any city in the world who are setting up businesses are from those communities. Why? Because they understand there's money to be made there and nobody else wants to go work there. So I have a house on a cul-de-sac of about 6 houses in South Africa, and the biggest house on our block, my next to next door neighbor, it's 6 Chinese families. They came in and bought this big house, and they started right across the street from us is Masipumalele. Masipumalele is a colored black township, and they started a grocery store right next door called the Food Zone. Okay, so every person working in Masipumalele walks by the Food Zone on their way to and from work. Everybody. Okay, now, they are going to make enough profit to buy this house and bring 6 families, because the children some are come now and some will come later. The whole family will eventually come. They're going to make enough money to buy this house, and eventually they'll each have a house, and to bring their families over to live a first world life in South Africa. And they are going to make all of that money off the people in Masipumalele. Now, how do they do it? Well, they bring in huge cargoes of Chinese cheap stuff. Cheap stuff that people in Masipumalele need. A coffee cup. They sell things in different amounts. You can buy a packet of 3 potatoes. You can buy 1 cigarette. You can buy a smaller portion of milk. They reduce everything down to little bits and pieces of what they need on a daily basis and can afford. Okay, so I bought a DVD player 2 weeks ago. I bought it at Pick and Pay, which is not our top grocery store, but it's probably the biggest one in South Africa. It cost me 199 rand. $25. I went down to the food zone, it's 200. Oh, that's not too bad, 1 rand difference. But I guarantee you on every product in that store, you are paying more than I pay at Pick and Pay and Woolworths. But they are gearing the quantities and the amount to the amount you might have that much change in your pocket today. Now, I will propose to you that that is very, very shrewd. But if they knew God, we would call it immoral. Now, I don't think they know God, and I don't think their intent is to hurt the people. I think they're Chinese, they're probably fatalist. Everybody's got their niche in society. These guys are bronze. Well, that's Greek. But innately, it is immoral because they could become successful and charge less. See, it's not, okay, you can't make a profit. It's, you can't make the profit quite that fast. But you can still bring the 6 families over, you can still own a home, but you don't do it by charging a little bit more to those who have the least. You do it by charging a little bit less over and start more stores. Because my gosh, do you know how many townships there are in South Africa? Masbuleta is a little one. But they don't think like that because business is about me. Now, God's business model is free market, private ownership, previously called capitalism. But you cannot call what we call capitalism today biblical. Because there was a third element to the scenario in God's design. Free market, private ownership, and community conscience. Free market, private ownership, and community conscience. Now, in the Western world, especially in America, we had that until 1947. But after World War II and the boom of development, including the baby boom, which is my generation, I'm at the earliest part of that, we dropped the community responsibility. We just enjoyed the good life. It's about the good life. It's about getting as much as you possibly can out of every deal. It's about having all the toys you can possibly dream of, and multiples if possible. Okay, so I don't want to teach capitalism because everybody in the world is looking at a capitalism that is not biblical because it's missing the third leg of the stool, which is community conscience. But capitalism, which came from Scripture as practiced 100 years ago, produced the highest economic development and the highest quality of life across the board in the world. Because when the Quakers got a hold of steel at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution in Europe, they captured the steel market for the purpose of making Europe wealthy, meaning everyone had a job, everyone had a home, everybody had a quality of life. Meaning communism, everybody had the same size home? No. So they went into a strategic business with a strategic profit motive, but they went into it with the strategic goal of creating other businesses out of this that would eliminate unemployment. And there is no unemployment in Switzerland. It doesn't exist. A poor man in Switzerland can't leave the country for his vacation. Poor guy. Got to stay in Switzerland. And much of Europe had at one point eliminated poverty, but now it's gaining on them. Why? Because they gave up God's principles. Europe less than America, but Europe also truly. Canada's done it in reverse. They just won't let anybody in. Although they have pretty good immigration. See, someday the world's going to wake up and look at Canada that's 90% uninhabited and go, why are they having all this land? So Canada's not thinking about how could we develop this land? How could we develop this continent so that more people could come? Build a higher quality of life. So they're not getting quality life for the people that are already there, but they're not thinking about how to use the assets God has given them. And of course, if we don't use the land God has given us, God will give it to somebody else. Okay, so enablement, and specifically strategies to enable the poor to help themselves. This is why microenterprise is such an ingenious invention. It's enablement. Small business loans. It's incredibly profitable. It's a little bit of profit on millions of loans. The Bible's lending code would be to lend to those who need it to enable themselves. So the lending code wouldn't be lend to people that already have debt. That's the American lending code. Or you have no debt and you have no assets. I can't loan you money. God would say that's exactly the guy you want to loan money to, or woman, because they have no debts, they have no assets, they have a high motivation to work, and they have a business plan. That's the one you should loan to. Forget Donald Trump. Loan this person $50. This person will build the economy. Donald Trump will destroy banks and jobs, which he has. He's part of our great explosion. Okay, I'm going to stop there because it's break time. A little bit more? One or two questions. The lending code of the Bible is exactly the opposite of the one in America. The lending code of the Bible is you lend to people who are desperate and have nothing, but have an idea for work to enable them. Because your time and your willingness to work is an asset. No American banking institution works like that. You are not an asset. Yeah, so you have to have a house or a car or something. You are not an asset. The way you got rid of your debt, the slavery in Scripture is indentured slavery. It was not that they became their property. It's that they had a debt and the guy said, okay, I'll come and work for you for X number of years to pay off my debt. Your work is an asset. Your time is an asset.
Biblical principle of what is today known as micro-loan?
Microenterprise, yes. Yeah. And it's very profitable.
Then what about when God says don't charge interest to others?
To your own people.
To others, yeah.
Isn't that weird? Yeah, that's in that chapter 23. If you only take that one passage, and there are several others, if you take them in isolation, it looks like God is pro-Jewish development and anti-development of anybody else. There's another one where he says, you will lend to many nations, but you will borrow from none. So it looks like, yeah, the Jews actually took it as an excuse to empower themselves economically at the expense of everybody. But if you take all the scriptures, it's clearly not that, because God is for all nations. So you have to think of it in terms of there have to be boundaries on financial responsibility. Okay, so your first responsibility financially is your spouse and your children. If you do not feed them, you are stealing from them. Now in Africa, there are no boundaries. I have to feed every child. If my responsibility is to feed every child, what will happen? We'll all be poor and we'll all be hungry. If my responsibility is first to feed my child and then, if I have extra, then my children are secure. Okay, if we're loaning to everybody at no interest, we will be broke. But if we don't help those who are nearest us, we will still be broke. So I think basically what you can say is God is saying you don't have to take care of everyone financially. You have to focus. So you don't change the global economy. You change your community economy. You change. So the Jews, when they migrate, first one migrates, they get a job, they make enough money to live on and save the extra and go get the next family. So the Jewish immigrants are never poor more than one generation. Okay? So they are never a liability on the economy they go to. Why? Because they take care of themselves. And God is simply saying it is fine to be selective in who you are responsible for. So you can focus, you can say, okay, my goal is this village. God has put this village in my heart. And it is not right to loan money at no interest to the entire world, but I may do that here. You with me? But it's not a two-tier system.
But he says to other believers.
Uh-huh.
So
Well, I don't think you really want to call the Jews believers, but let's call them Jewish. They're all over the place.
So in theory, a Jew should not charge another Jew interest.
Well, if they're Orthodox, they still don't.
We should not charge other believers interest.
No, because we are not a nation of Christians. So that's why when you call Jews believers, yeah, some of them actually were, but they were also a nation. Was most of the nation believers? Clearly not. So Jews are two things. So do we have to apply it only to people in the same religion as us? No. That would make you more Muslim than biblical. Do we have to apply it to our country versus any other country? No, because we're called to the nations. But there are borders that we can put on where we're working economically so that we have solid fruit somewhere.
Maybe after the break or hopefully now, can you help bridge what you're sharing, how you would integrate this with, well, like India, a nation of the middle class and upper class is 300 million people, and it's considered one of the more unreached areas. How would you integrate this and try to reach that sector of society too?
Well, you always have to start with a lot of research, and India deserves a ton of research because it is, I mean, even compared to the Chinese phenomena, I think India is moving and shaking. So the Tatas of India are fascinating to me. I mean, he basically is the Henry Ford of early America. Let's not make a cell phone for the Swiss that costs $600. Let's make a cell phone for the Indians that costs $20 and it's got time on it. Let's not make a car for the Swedish people to drive. Let's make a car for Indians. It costs, what is it, $2,000, $3,000 because of the emerging middle class. Now this is so biblical, unbelievably biblical. He recognizes that the future is in India and he's investing in India. And Indians overseas are investing in India, unbelievably. So that's just, that so rarely happens, but the IT schools in India have now surpassed the IT schools in America and Europe, because IT specialists who are Indians in other countries are sending money back to start these institutions. Now, it's a big country. So even if the middle class doubles in the next 10 years, you've got 1 billion people that aren't even on the bottom rung. So my question would be, how do we work from the bottom? Working from the top is going pretty well. So meaning, what India is doing from the top of industry is going pretty well. They've got some very creative things going. But India will never think about working from the bottom because it doesn't think in terms of masses. So how can, and ultimately the economy won't be sound until you're working from the poorest of the poor up. Working from the exclusive class down will never reach the bottom. So I would be focusing my attention on exactly where the poorest of the poor are, who are they, why are they. I can tell you for sure that the problem of those people are lending sharks that are taking their land and taking compounded interest and running all sorts of scams that are disempowering them because they're in another class. So I'd want to get in there and look at some loaning options to eliminate the loan sharking, look at some options for their kids' education. That's where I'd start. But I have to do a ton of research before I'd know it was strategic.